now we're going to invite Maarten, who I can see if I'm correct. Welcome. Maarten, for those of you who don't know, he's an old IRP colleague. He's worked on many publications with the IRP. We've asked him to put on his hat as a professor, where he works in the Netherlands, and I forget the institution, Maarten, but you can remind us. But more importantly, we've asked Maarten to come in this now from a different perspective. So we want Maarten to say to us, as we listen to him, he's going to talk to us about urbanization and cities. So we got that big picture from Professor Lutz, which gave us almost like understanding how demographic trends work, how they influence, what's the drivers. And now Maarten is going to bring it one level down and talk to us about urbanization and the cities and what does this look like in the future. And like I say, we are asking this question as the International Resources Panel because we want to understand where we need to go with our next research. Maarten, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Marilyn, and good to be on this webinar. Can you now see my screen? And is it now fully shared? Let's see. Is it fully shared?
Marteen. Yes.
Okay. Okay, I was going to give you an update on our work on urbanization. And urbanization is one of those issues where if we don't act, we definitely just considering what we need for urbanization won't meet Paris goals. We will use biodiversity to an extent that's unsustainable, or we take a turn and we provide sort of a different idea of what the urban could be like. And that's what my talk is about. So it could be, in urbanization terms, our best century or our worst. I will draw on a report that the IRP drafted, and it was released in 2018. It's called The Weight of Cities, and the weight refers to resource requirements of future urbanization. And I co-led that research effort with Mark Swilling. And basically, the sort of demographic basics that a colleague Lutz was just referring to also are underpinning this report. And we use the UN DESA statistics primarily. And the key element, I suppose, when it comes to urbanization to consider are the following. It's not only that people go to cities in large numbers, as we predict that will continue to 2050, it's partly to escape poverty. And it's also because people become more richer and more wealthy if they live in urban contexts. But they, at the moment, end up in informal urban settlements. And these two taken together are constituting a big challenge in urbanization terms. And then we haven't even talked about the sustainability issue. However, we should and must, because, and this is the Václav Smil statistic, who you probably saw at some presentation somewhere, because it's so stunning. He calculated that China used in 3 years as much cement as the United States used in the entire 20th century. So the way in which we build cities with steel beams and with cement concrete is a way of building cities that if we calculated, and we did that in the Weight of Cities, and we would build the projected future urbanization with these materials, simply that would blow the fuses of the planet, meaning that we would not reach the Paris goals. When it comes to urbanization, one should also take into account that there is a historic trend for de-densification. So what that means is that if people go to cities and they become slightly wealthier, they tend to suburbanize. So they move out of the sort of the hard urban fabric. They have an ideal of a home with a lawn and a car. And that means suburbanization. And if you look at that effect, you can see it in the graph comparing Atlanta and Barcelona, which in terms of the population is about the same. You see that the mobility induced CO2 emissions are 10% higher, or 10 times higher in Atlanta than they are in Barcelona. So there is a relationship between the density of cities, or the sprawl, and our sustainability challenge. Now, I said best century or worst, and that means that we also have done some work on what we could do about it. And it is pretty basic, actually, what we have come up with. And that is why I think we need to spend more time thinking, why is it not taken, that road that we sort of spell out and many others spell out with us? And that's what my discussion will be about in a short while. So first of all, it is of course good to know all of this, and 40% of the urban fabric of 2050 still has to be built. So we can still take a turn if we would build cities in a different way. And of course, if you have a sort of a sustainability goal and you don't have any sort of funding, it is difficult to see how you can sort of bend the trend. But if you think that precisely in building cities, this is incredible business. So it is not as if there is no money, it is just applied in the wrong direction. And in this new climate economy report, they calculate that it is a minor 5% difference between building a climate-proof city and building a city with the same sort of facilities like roads and housing blocks and pipes and what have you. That is completely wasteful. So it's slightly more expensive at the outset, but of course, in terms of environmental costs, it would be a good investment nevertheless. So what we do in the Weight of Cities report is that we look at a few elements that you should then take together. And I suppose if you look at the recent articles in Nature and other sort of first-rate scientific journals, you see that we put more and more emphasis on the need to combine crises, so to say, to don't think about resolving a particular crisis in its own particular domain. It won't work. You have to square the circle by making the problem more complex, and then you get closer to actually working solutions. So what we did in the Weight of Cities is we said, first of all, you need to address urban form on the left. Then secondly, we need to think about energy conservation strategies, so insulate homes, for instance, or find new ways of cooling homes, sometimes going back to what we knew from the past, all these strategies of cooling homes that you, for instance, still see in classical building types in Iran, but of course that in the 20th century have made way for air conditioning. Use energy efficiency strategies. Think about people awareness, which is a big factor, that people realize that their behavior matters, and then bring energy consumption down. And if you look at these things independently, it's far less interesting than if you look at them in combination, because then you can actually see that you can bring these emissions down by tenfold. Now, recently, in a report that Edgar Hertwig and Ralf Lipset led, we added new information also on how research efficiency can help us on this road. And there, what they, of course, showed is that the production side and actually the extraction of materials is a incredible source of CO2. And again, you see that is something that often relates directly to urbanization. So the building industry is very impactful, just as is the transport industry. Now, if you reflect on the nature of cities, you must realize that the way we build that urban form could actually be done in a different way, but that would be far less energy and also material intensive. And of course, if we build denser cities, there is far less of a need for sort of private vehicles. However, if we seriously want to contemplate that, we have to think about the sociological dimension of it, because people become more affluent and therefore always want more square meters in their homes. They become more affluent and they want to have a garden. They become more affluent, they want to have a car. But that is precisely what we can't afford. So how can we think of a urban lifestyle that does not require people for their happiness to have more square meters and always have their own car? Now that is why we think that rethinking what we call the imaginary of a city is crucial if we want to have sustainability effects, and not merely pointing out, like we have been doing for 50 years as environmental scientists, that there are options. Think of Ernst von Weizsäcker. I mean, factor 4, factor 10. I mean, his whole career has shown the possibility of an alternative, and we haven't lived up to that environmental science. So there is a sociological dimension that requires more attention. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, a third step that I think we as IRP have to undertake is to think about alternative building materials. And so we must just stop using concrete as sort of our you know, it's basically our first material. No, think about bio-based materials whenever we can and use concrete when it is absolutely necessary. And there are two candidates there, which is bamboo, which is of course a fast-growing crop, and it is timber. So bamboo in the global south and timber in particular in the global north. And you can build with that with a new sort of really high-tech technique. It's called cross-laminated timber. So you press actually the timber, or you, for that matter, press the bamboo. Chinese industry is already working with that, and in the timber, it's the Europeans and the Canadian and Americans in particular that are pioneering that. Now, so there are alternative building materials, and we want to, of course, then calculate what that would do. Interestingly, I think that using these bio-based materials precisely does what we need. Namely, you see that people who are wealthy in Europe now think it is a good thing to have a bio-based building. So it's not a poor man's material anymore, like concrete used to be. If you're really wealthy, you can afford yourself a concrete house or a brick house. Now it seems to be, and you can see that in the architectural journals, for instance, that building with wood is a trendy thing. So that is tapping into that sociological imagination that we need to get beyond this phenomenon, thinking that there is no alternative. So there is an alternative. So the way in which you then have to approach urbanization is to first do the math. So understand what scenarios we can make to reach the 2 or 1.5 degree goals. But combine that with the idea of imaginaries. And Sheila Jasanoff, a colleague from Harvard, defined that as collectively held and performed visions of desirable futures. And I think that is something that next to the math we should bring in combination, because then people will actually not realize that cognitively they have to go in a particular direction and do the math, but also aspire a particular future. And that is a far more powerful mover of behavior. And ultimately, and I will come back to that too, it also implies that we need to bring urban planning back in, which is something that at the moment is not in the prominent position it should be in. I'll talk a bit about these techniques of futuring, how we can do that, and I will do that by historically going back to how we ended up building with concrete and steel. And the irony of that history is that people like Le Corbusier, who invented this whole new modern style of building, did so because they realized that these new materials allowed for people who were living in damp and bad housing could move up the ladder. They could move into buildings that were healthy, that were good for them. And very easily you would say that you would now combine that with environmental benefits. But at the time, so they used the innovation, the fact that we could build with steel frames and concrete to create a utopian world. Of course, irony abounds because this was the example that Corbusier then came up with, the Plan Voisin, which is about the area of Paris where the Centre Pompidou is located. He wanted to knock that down for it to make way for what he called the high rise in the park. So the idea of that utopian alternative to the Parisian districts was looking a bit like this. Of course, we are happy that he didn't quite get it his way. However, you recognize that type of building as something that has, well, started in the 1920s, has been mimicked in the 1950s. This is St. Louis, a Brit Eagle building. It has been mimicked in the 1960s in, for instance, Amsterdam, using the Bijlmer. It was dynamited in 1972 because it was unlivable in America, and it was dynamited and taken apart in 1992 in Amsterdam. And then, of course, the tragedy is that in the global south, we see again that sort of structure of cities with high-rise buildings being imitated once again. And the question is, I suppose, when do we demolish this, and at what environmental costs? Now, the point of this talk is that there is an alternative, and that alternative is, for instance, promoted by UN Habitat. It is promoted by many colleagues of mine in the urban sociology departments of the universities. And that argument is building cities with neighborhoods as a central building block. Now, in this talk, it's of course crucial for me to combine that alternative with a post-fossil future, and a future that is less resource intensive. And you just imagine how the magnitude of that shift. We need to think our energy resources, we need to rethink our mobility, our very shelter, how we live, what sort of dwellings we have, and we need to rethink what we eat. And then it's not only about post-fossil, it is also to be about justice. Can we turn that bend? Well, we think we can, and we can do that, and we must do that, basically undoing the mistakes of 20th century urbanization. However, if I look at what is happening at the moment, it's not as if this sort of ideal of a world of neighborhoods is dominant. Far more prominent in the discussions is the notion of a smart city, and I'm very critical of that. I think that the smart city is an example of a corporate imaginary where there is a set of products that's being sold to urban leaderships and suggesting that whatever is wired is good. And you get this type of imaginaries from, for instance, in this particular case, it's Siemens, but there are many more, and suggesting that applying all these sort of high-tech solutions to cities resolve the problems of the cities, but they don't address the need to think about these cities in a more profound way. And more profound then for me is to what I here say in this book of 2014, these challenges, is to think about cities as a metabolic entity where you have an input, you need all sort of energy to put in, you have the water and material demands, and of course you have output, which is environmental effects and CO2 and what have you. So if you look at input output, you can of course then think, okay, can we use smart technologies to help that? And in some cases, smart technologies will help, but smart in itself is not something to aspire to. That's my point, right? It has to be instrumentally led by a deeper ideal. And that is also because I think otherwise you may end up with a Corbusian future in which it is basically occurring in a digitalized form, but it has not actually reflected on what made the modern city such a bad model when it comes to the environment and to social justice. So let's then think about what a good city could be like if we would start from the neighborhood onwards. And that again, I have been able to put in a book which is just out in 2020, and it's called Neighborhoods for the Future, a plea for a social and ecological urbanism. And what this book does, it takes the IRP report as a baseline. So we basically say, okay, we've now found the math. Now let's see if there are areas in the world that actually already live up to that expectation, and think what if we would follow that track our cities could look like. And I give you a few examples, and I should immediately say these examples are from Europe and North America. It's just because I have a very tiny research group and I wasn't able to do it in a bigger way, but I really would love to revisit this and do it in a global perspective. The point of it is that we looked at neighborhoods like here Vauban in Freiburg, or here Bo 01 in Malmö, that achieved remarkable results in sustainability, and then try to analyze how they did it. So what can we learn from the institutional rules that they had in place that led to this sort of environment and to the far less impactful sustainability records. And sometimes they look a bit modern, actually, like Regent Park. But if you realize that this was a neighborhood that was crime-ridden, full of drugs, with a very uneven social makeup, and now is a mixed neighborhood with rich and poor, and with high quality environment and amenity like the swimming pool here to the left, you think, and this sort of a communal garden in a social housing, this is a social housing block that you see, this is what they've been able to build with a far less impactful energy system. Then of course you realize that you have to study these cases in order to sort of bottom up come to a scenario that says, well, what if we would follow these type of examples on a global scale? And there are other cases that we then analyze for their particular elements. So like, for instance, here, Hunziger Areal, where they did take as a basic principle, we can only give people so much energy on a daily basis that would we would be able to give to everybody in the world, so that the justice would be fairly shared. And then what does it look like? And the funny thing is, very unexpected for many people, that it is ultimately livable. Only thing is, people don't have private cars, and lots of things like washing machines are recollectivized like it was in the 1950s, and then their impact is far less. Now, I think that one of the crucial things to get urbanization right is to find ways to avoid suburbanization as the logical step for cities that get richer, where the middle classes grow. And Roger Kyle, a colleague from Canada, suggests, well, we live now on a suburban planet. And so my argument with the neighborhoods book is to say, yes, that's true, but we could move back and reconquer sort of the suburbs by bringing the density up. And we calculated that sort of the density that you need for a sustainable future is about 11,000 people per square kilometer. If you get that on average, you're good. And for those who can't imagine what that looks like, so Paris and Barcelona are on the higher end of the density equation, and they have about 22,000 people per square kilometer, or 24,000 per square kilometer. And so it's far less dense than Barcelona necessarily. And of course you can, because it's an average, you can sort of differentiate a bit in between. But that is a possibility to think about these neighborhoods. Now, while I'll express that this book has examples from the global north, I mean, I'm already sort of exploring how that could be re-articulated, also using examples from the global south. And of course, then one often thinks about a city like Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Well, what happened there is that in a city that really grows very fast, they gave it a backbone of a light rail, as Chinese built light rail system. And if you look at how that functions, you actually see that light rail. It's early days and it doesn't function perfectly at all at the moment, but it is the backbone organizing neighborhoods and allowing people very quickly from the neighborhood to work. And very importantly, and this may not look very beautiful, but I don't care about aesthetics in the first place, it's about functionality. What they did here is that they organized, they kept the shops, so they kept the possibility in the urban fabric that the informal markets slowly move into the formal economy. And often what you see when you get these sort of default modernist developments is that they cancel out that sort of first floor development here for the little shops, and you get the supermarketization, and that's often foreign capital, and it's not at all allowing people into business. So these small things do make a difference. Now, the weight of cities is a quite a complex report, actually, also because we, Mark and I, are political scientists, and therefore we think that you have to connect an argument about an environmental future also to thinking about how can we get there. And again, it's striking that our governance system is not one that is oriented to collaboration. I do see glimpses where you see that we can actually move in that direction. And we think that is absolutely necessary to go there. So to move from a corporatist urban governance where you have a leadership that's often vulnerable to sort of project developers that want to promote, say, for instance, shopping mall developments. And we say, well, look much more in the direction of Mariana Mazzucato's work and apply that entrepreneurial urban governance. So say, what is my mission? Define your goal of a green city that is ultimately just and sustainability and meets its sustainability criteria, and think what fits into that envelope. Also, try and move out of the long promoted idea that cities have to compete with each other, to think of how you could collaborate and cooperate with each other, because if one city makes a mistake, there's no need for another city to make that mistake again. And there are, of course, lots of examples thereof I'll touch upon in a second. And from a vulnerable hierarchical go also to move and allow urban citizens in, I think then you would never make mistakes like going for shopping mall, but keep smaller shops in the equation as well. So one could do that, for instance, by investing in horizontal collaboration through the G40, ICLE, WRR, etc. So these sort of institutions, I think, are important for governance towards sustainability. And of course, as you will have gathered, I argue that we need to also invest in promoting these imaginaries, showing that alternative cities can actually live and are ultimately livable. It's not something that environmental scientists want to sort of impose on people. It's actually an ultimately livable alternative to the concrete jungles that we've erected over the last 100 years. Now, a word of caution, also to ourselves, of course, when we make new storylines. We have an inclination to think that people are persuaded by facts. But social psychologists, and actually economists too, will tell you that that is not the case. People are enticed by perspective. They move to a future if they think that future holds an alternative or a possibility for a life worth living. And that element we should, I think, consequently add to a new type of work. And then you get these sort of exclamations that come from my empirical research, that people often don't see the alternative, but if you show it to them, they say, if it could be like that, then I'm game. I collaborate. That's what I want. So that is an element of bringing planning back in, creating these persuasive storylines about the future. That should be part and parcel of our work. Now, to conclude, I see city planning as world building. I hope I've shown that urbanization is a prime sustainability challenge. We can take it on, but then we have to also think about urban planning again, put new building materials on the agenda and do the math, because it's a difficult agenda also, because it has consequences, of course, for where you grow it. Is that sustainable in itself? Does it affect biodiversity? Does it affect agricultural uses of land, etc.? Very important to get that straight. Revisit the good city as a part of an environmental agenda, and use urban infrastructure like the railway the light rail that I showed in Addis, to make people see that there is indeed an alternative shaping new aspirations. Thanks for your attention. I'm going to try and unshare.
Thank you so much, Maarten. That was absolutely excellent. I like how you framed your intervention. And instead of doing the traditional, how much will the world be urbanizing, how many cities, you actually asked a fundamental question, which assumes that we're going to have to build cities, right? So that's your assumption. And then you use the 2050 date, and we know why that date is significant, because that's around the climate targets and net zero and all of that. And you say, if we're looking at 2050, what can we imagine in terms of building the cities of the future? So I like the way you've come at it from a very different perspective. At least that's my takeaway. And then you reminded us, particularly for me, I'm not a scholar of urbanization and cities, but I liked the way you framed your question to us was, how did we end up with the cities we have? And you mentioned this person, Kobeji, if I pronounce it correctly, and you said, do we want to end up with that again? And that's such a good question, because it talks to our topic of today, which is reimagining the future. And then you've ended it very philosophical, but I think it's very practical, where you said, somebody said to you, if we can make people see the alternatives, they will grab those alternatives. I also like the way you use the fact that we know there's a lot of language around smart cities. And then you push back on that and you say, well, actually, there's an alternative. And you call it this concept of neighborhoods. And you call it post-fossil fuel cities. And finally, your governance issue, also very important. So how do we want to imagine our cities, which, as I say, your starting point is we're going to see this rapid urbanization. So can we imagine a different future? And then you speak about how to build differently. you know, to use different materials, material efficiency. So lots of room for thought. I can see a lot of chats. I know I cannot see everything, Marten, but I have a colleague who's going to collate maybe 3 at a time. And for those of you who are putting questions in the chat, if we don't get to you, it's only because we've run out of time, and we will make sure that we incorporate your questions in our exercise for our global resource outlook going forward. But Maria Jose, over to you to give Marten his first question.
Yes, many interesting questions. Let me group them by categories of these elements of your urban vision that you just presented. Talking about materials, Esther is asking, could you explain your optimism on bio-based materials? She says that in the past, we have had this discussion on bio-based energy, which should have solved all of our problems, but it didn't. She also says that for construction materials, the size of the system is so large that it may not be feasible. The problem is not that concrete is a polluting material, it's per kilogram impacts are actually quite low. She says the problem is we need very large quantities. That's about materials. Then there are a couple of questions on your vision of neighborhoods. It's from Julia Okats, building cities with neighborhoods. Can you elaborate on what that means? If, you know, not high rises, we still need relative dense, compact structures. So what would buildings look like? Then Matteo Ledesma is asking, could you elaborate a bit more on the spatial planning changes needed to facilitate the consolidated neighborhoods? Would you think this will pose a challenge in terms of decentralizing planning, basically? And those are it for now.
Can you repeat the third one? I was taking notes
Sure.
from the second. Yeah.
Yes. The third one is, could you elaborate a little bit more on the spatial planning changes needed to facilitate the consolidated neighborhoods concept?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Maria. If Esther's point is, of course, taken in the sense that it would be preposterous to think that we can build all these cities with bio-based materials, and indeed, I see more and more the tragedy of bio fuels repeat itself with bio-based materials, and in a sense that there is now an increased demand. Therefore, people start to chop down trees in an unsustainable manner because it's a market, and there you go. However, I think we must explore ways in which to rethink sort of sustainable forestry practice. That's where sustainability as a concept came from, after all, in the 19th century. The sustainable yield of trees, that was the essence of sustainability in it when it was first invented. And we better do that right now and see what we can do with these bio-based materials, because they, of course, for many building materials and building sites are indeed having an alternative. Julia's point about density is actually an illustration of a mistake that's often made, namely this idea that high-rise is dense. That's not necessarily the case. If you see the typical high-rise development, you see that outside the building there is a large open space. So, for instance, for car parking, or it is just because the building site itself requires some space around it. It's not as if Manhattan is what we see being built everywhere over the world. It is these typical socket with 5 towers on top of it, like you see in China, you see in Iran, and elsewhere being built. So if you do the urban sort of scholarship work, you actually end up with an alternative which is medium high rise, which is up to 8 floors high, and that can be more denser. Moreover, if you look in the report Resource Efficiency and Climate Change, a recent IRP report, you will see that they spot an obvious issue, namely, if we can actually reduce the number of square meters that we use for private usage, that also has a resource impact. And of course, if you do that, then you run against the trend that people who become more affluent want to have more square meters for themselves. So here you have to then think also culturally, what would it require from the public space for people to be acceptable to have less square meters? Now, we know that it requires a very active, very dynamic, very functional public space with restaurants, with services that cater for stuff that you therefore no longer want to have into the home, etc. And then people put up or actually like that better and have less square meters. So again, to invoke the Manhattan example, in Manhattan people tend to have far less square meters for themselves, but they have very tiny kitchens. Why is that? Because most of the time they eat out twice a day or so because it is so cheap. I mean, very middle class perspective here, of course, but still, by and large, that is the way in which it works. And the medium height has the benefit that it does not require to put in all these extra services that are energy intensive, like elevators and the like. And the planning example, so the point we make about neighborhoods is that you should consider that a building block. Of a planning strategy. Let's not forget that people in the global south lose a lot of time and money to get from home to work. Why is that? Because on a citywide scale, we have separated out work and dwellings. Historically, we know why that is, because work used to be very dirty and so forth, but lots of work is no longer very dirty. Service type of work can be much closer to homes, therefore allowing people to reconnect work and where they actually live on a neighborhood scale. So that is what you already see in Chinese cities, in Beijing. You see it in new quarters and so forth, reconnecting work and where people live to get out of these perennial traffic jams. But the point then, of course, is that you no longer on a citywide scale, but on a neighborhood scale want to actually plan these different functions: education, homes, and also work.
Thank you, Martin. I have some questions from Heinz, and it's more about the broader vision. He's interested in knowing your outlook of what is going to happen to urban infrastructure by 2060 in different parts of the world. So what is going to be the mix between mega cities, secondary cities? What kind of networks will we have of cities? What is a plausible future in comparison to your vision of urbanism? And he added, of course, you could say that we have no choice other than engaging in the positive vision, but is this really likely, actually? Do the numbers you have get us to a point in this direction of global green cities or not? Maybe because that's a very long question, I'll leave it there and continue with others later.
Okay, now, so, I mean, I think for scenario work, it's really important to consider that we may want to also think about, okay, what if these things that we see work on the level of a city would become the standard? And to not impose on our scenarios our realistic attitudes of now. So the notion that we use for that is what we call the evolutionary potential of the present. So you see that at a particular location, an alternative is mature. You say, okay, so it's mature in that context. There is no reason why that could not also be spread around. What would then, how would that scenario, what would that scenario look like? So that is, I think, is it likely? Well, that's a way of evading that question, I suppose, but also to make sure that we get these positive scenarios in the mix. Otherwise, we, as academics, impose our realism on how policymakers make their decisions, and we may be wrong there, and we have been proven wrong a lot of the times actually over the past. Now, again, when you ask me, so what will these cities look like in 2060? One should not forget that our perception of cities is wrong compared to what cities actually look like. We tend to think about cities like global cities, like Tokyo or London, or we look at Dubai as something that holds the future. By and large, that's not the case. The bulk of urbanization are cities of 500,000 and less. That's so totally different from how we perceive cities. Our imagination of cities is dominated by these global cities that grow, and one has 10 million and the other has 20 million. And again, that's the discursive bias that we have to face. But the people who are interested in the sort of really urban statistics have been pointing out that that has never been the case, and it is most likely will not be the case. So India, for instance, again, is a case, of course, we have very big cities, but the bulk of the urbanization on the Indian subcontinent will be in that range of cities up to 500,000. If you factor that in, that allows for very different infrastructure. It doesn't have to be incredibly expensive systems, because on the size of a city of 500,000, you can get away with far cheaper mobility systems, because the distances that people have to travel is also less. So if you want have more days, I can also provide the references on that. When we prepared the Weight of Cities report, we dealt a lot with these sort of issues ourselves.
Thank you, Martin. There's a set of questions about, of course, COVID, the pandemic, by Media, Steffi, and Farid, and they are asking, will we see new trends, new perspectives on, how, housing is located, working, how societies are functioning around those cities? How will the pandemic change demands on urban structure? And Farid says, what is the impact of working from home, for instance, and in terms of that, those imaginaries, urban imaginaries that you were presenting?
Yeah. Now, of course, this is the question that urbanists are called to answer most at the moment, actually. It's combination. So on the one hand, all the evidence seems to suggest that we will not go back to life as we had to pre-COVID, and at the same time we won't completely change our lifestyles, and of course we will start flying again, etc. So if you look at the figures from business, the suggestion is even from business themselves, they say it's probably cheaper and more efficient if people work from home, say 2 days a week, and go to the office, say 3 days a week. So that in terms of mobility, that's really good for sustainability. And in terms of the office space that stands empty and has to be heated and so forth, it's also good because they will shrink. However, I would immediately add a planning concern and a planning challenge, because if people would start to work from home, then say, hey, I need more square meters, right? Because I now work from home, therefore I need to have a study with lots of books. So what we argue there, no. We should think about consolidated neighborhoods. So think about the typical high street in London and so forth, where you see an emptying out because shops are replaced by digital services and so forth. What do we do with all these empty shops? Now, a planning argument would be try and make shared offices in the neighborhood so that people can go out of their homes, which often they also like, because it's it's a change of scenery. It's also they're on their own. They're not constantly in sitting on top of each other, so to say. So try and solve that issue of working closer to home on a neighborhood basis. But then it's not as if that automatically happens. You have to think of that imaginary and try and implement it. And that is, of course, what we now also see city governments considering at the moment.
Okay, and I think we only have one question left from the chat, and it's from Peter Jensen, and he talks about gentrification. He says a lot of urban development is in reality about gentrifying rundown neighborhoods. The model is successful in terms of housing values, but are we not just moving the social problem around by investing in housing stock? Is that leading to a reduced resource demand? Gentrification?
Yeah, so gentrification, Peter is absolutely right, is one of the central concerns in the urban sociology literature, of course. And there, the tragedy is that if a neighborhood sort of picks up, people move in, the prices of the property go up, and poor people are driven out. But again, why look at gentrification as something that is a sort of quasi-natural process? It is not. You can actually do something about it. So the example of Toronto comes to mind, Regent Park, because what they basically there did, I mean, that would have been a lovely neighborhood for gentrification. They basically gave everybody who left the buildings that were knocked down to make place for the new fabric a right of return. And not only a right of return, but also a right of return at the rents that they had. And how could they do that? Because they paid for it by selling the condominiums at a higher price. So if you say gentrification is something to take very seriously, yes. But to say the harsh sort of neoliberal urban governance that basically say, well, you can't do anything about it. This is the market that decides. That's just putting planning on the sideline, and that's something that also with sustainability concerns is not a good idea. I argue vehemently for a reinvention of planning and also not looking at housing as just as a market, but also as a human right. I mean, otherwise you can't really you don't take your SDGs seriously. So you have to have a building stock also at the bottom that's rent controlled, and then you can also steer by pricing other areas up, and therefore use the money that you gain there to pay for that sort of scheme.
Thank you, Marilyn. I don't have any extra questions from the chat, so over to you.
Thank you. We're actually right on time, Martin. And thank you, Maria Jose, for helping to make sure that we reflect all of the questions. And like I said, from the earlier panel, there were some questions we weren't able to accommodate, but we will find a way to do so. Martin, all of which is to say thank you to you. I have one last question though, because you started in your introduction by mentioning that very important report, The Weight of Cities. And that's actually a very good title in terms of how what cities mean for our consumption, our production, and other patterns. And my final question to you, as we go forward to the global resources outlook, what should be our new research question when it comes to asking this question about the weight of cities, the future weight of cities? We all know intuitively that it doesn't need to be so intensely energy consumption heavy. We know that there are ways to deal with that. So what would be the new research question for us as the IRP in this field?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I think that idea of what sort of alternative notions of a city or imaginaries of a city can we come up with that do show that even with the massive urbanization that lies ahead, allows us to stick to, say, goals like the Paris Agreement. And that would build up not only on the weight of cities, it would build up on the report on food systems, because it's also by diets. It would build up on the resource efficiency report that we just released, where they say, well, mobility and the building industry are two areas that we really have to investigate deeper into. And as an urbanist, of course, say, well, that happened to be two deeply urban sort of component parts. But if we would be able to combine doing the math in the Global Research Outlook with, bringing to life these notions of what those cities would look like, and also convey to people that they ultimately livable, actually that they are in many regards of more livable than the cities we currently live in, I think then we have a very nice and complex actually research agenda, but worth working on.
And what's your favorite city that meets all of your aspirations? Or is that putting you on the spot?
Yeah, no. I think Barcelona is a fantastic case. I mean,
Okay.
and Barcelona is a city that not only erected the super block grid, but is now revisiting that whole grid, pushing out the cars, bringing in greenery, making them greener and cooler again, and shows that the city is ultimately livable and meeting the sustainability standards that we have in mind.
Great. If there's anybody listening from Barcelona, Maarten just gave a good shout out to your city. But Maarten, all of which is to do is to say thank you. We're going to wrap up now to our participants who've stayed with us for 2 hours. Thank you so much. And like I said, this is the first in our series of trying to imagine the global future. And why are we doing it? We're doing it because we want to get some of the world's influential thinkers and scholars, but also engage with all of you who've asked questions that make us think as we go into our new strategic planning, but also our flagship report, which is the Global Resources Outlook. And so for all of you who have joined, thank you for staying with us.